The drought of 1998 didn't just kill the corn. It peeled back the skin of the earth and revealed what my family had been trying to bury for 3 generations. In the Midwest, we don't talk about the things that don't make sense. We talk about the price of diesel and the humidity. But on the Miller farm, located 3 miles outside of a town too small to have a stoplight, we had one rule that superseded all others: never stay outside after the crickets stopped chirping. My name is Clara, and I grew up in the shadow of the silo, eventually moving to Chicago to escape the suffocating silence of the plains. I was pulled back last July when my father passed away, returning to settle the estate while thinking I was old enough to be immune to the superstitions of my youth. The well sits in the back 40, a patch of land that hasn't been tilled since the Great Depression, capped with a heavy wooden lid and secured by a rusted iron chain. My grandfather used to say the water was sour, but we all knew that wasn't why we were forbidden from playing near it. On my 3rd night back, the air was thick enough to chew, the humidity sitting on the porch like a heavy animal. I was sitting on the swing, sipping lukewarm tea, when the sunset dipped below the horizon and stained the sky a bruised, sickly purple. Then, the crickets went silent, not a gradual fade, but a sudden, violent absence of sound that left a vacuum in the air. In that silence, I heard a soft, wet, rasping sound coming from the direction of the back 40, a voice that sounded like dry leaves scraping against a gravestone. It whispered my name, a sigh projected from deep underground that chilled my blood despite the heat. I should have gone inside and locked the deadbolt, but the voice didn't just sound familiar. It sounded like my sister, Sarah. Sarah had disappeared 20 years ago, and while the police said she ran away, my father always insisted she had been taken by the land. I grabbed a heavy flashlight and started walking, the dry stalks of grass sounding like whispering voices as they whipped against my shins. As I approached the well, the temperature plummeted so sharply that my breath began to mist in the air, a physical impossibility in a 90-degree Indiana July. The chain on the well was rattling with a rhythmic pulsing, as if something beneath the wood was breathing with a heavy, labored effort. I reached the stone perimeter and noticed the stones were slick, covered in a black, oily moss that smelled of copper and wet earth. When I shone my light on the wooden cover, I saw the planks pulsating, the rod appearing to move in time with the heartbeat of the earth. I whispered her name into the dark, my voice trembling with a mix of grief and terror. The voice changed then, no longer sounding like Sarah, but breathing out the names of my grandfather and my father in a roll call of the dead. I realized the well wasn't just whispering names. It was collecting them, acting as a ledger for everyone the soil had claimed. I reached for the iron chain, but before I could touch it, a hand emerged from the narrow gaps in the stone. It was a hand made of gray silt and tangled roots, the fingers elongated and translucent as they gripped the edge of the well. Then a face appeared, a horrifying composite of my family members with eyes like Sarah has and a jawline like my father says. The creature's mouth was far too wide, filled with teeth that looked like jagged pieces of quartz, and its pupils reflected my flashlight like a predator in the brush. It told me I was late and that they had been keeping my place warm, its voice a dissonant harmony of a dozen dead millers. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping and sweeping across the field in a strobe-like effect that revealed dozens of pale, spindly figures. They were emerging from the earth itself, their bodies woven from soil and corn husks, moving with a jerky stop-motion gait. I finally understood that the farm didn't belong to us. We belonged to the farm, serving as the tribute required to keep the harvest coming. The thing at the well pulled itself halfway out, its lower half remaining a slurry of black water and roots as it hissed about the thirst of the soil. I turned and bolted, not looking back even as I heard the wet thwack of mud-slicked feet hitting the dirt behind me. I ran until my lungs burned, slamming the farmhouse door and shoving a heavy oak dresser against it to bar the way. All night, they whispered and scratched at the siding, tapping on the windows with fingernails that sounded like stones. When the sun finally rose, the silence that returned was not peaceful, but the calculated quiet of a predator waiting for its next opening. I walked outside in the harsh morning light to find my flashlight sitting on the stone ledge of the well, as if it had been placed there as a gift. Next to it lay a single, fresh yellow petal from a sundress and a date carved into the wood of the cover, August 12th. I tried to flee that afternoon, but when I reached the end of the driveway, the corn grew with supernatural speed, weaving a wall across the road. I am trapped here now, watching the shadows stretch out from the trees like long dark fingers as the sun begins to set. The crickets have just stopped chirping again, and I can hear the whisper coming from beneath the floorboards. I've realized that fire won't save me, as the dirt is always waiting beneath the flame, ready to reclaim what it is owed. My sister's voice is right behind my ear now, clear and cold, telling me that the struggle is useless against the weight of the earth. I am the last miller, and the well is finally calling me by my full name, demanding the final payment for a century of crops. The floorboards are beginning to pulse, and the smell of wet earth is filling the kitchen, signaling that the back 40 has finally come to the front door. The warnings didn't come in whispers. They came in the form of heavy silences and averted eyes. When I inherited my aunt's farm in the jagged hills of rural Kentucky, the locals at the diner 3 towns over stopped chewing when I mentioned the property. Some land don't like being owned, one old man had muttered into his coffee. I laughed it off as the typical territorial grumbling of a dying town. I was Ilara, a PhD candidate with a laptop and a need for solitude. I thought isolation was a gift. I didn't realize that being alone just makes it easier for the things in the dark to find their target. The farm was a sprawling skeletal thing, the house a gray Victorian with windows that looked like hollow eye sockets. It sat at the end of a 5-mile dirt track that turned into a slurry of red clay after the first rain. By the third night, I was completely cut off. The humidity was a physical weight, thick with the smell of wet cedar and something sharper, the metallic tang of old blood. It was when the sun dipped behind the pines, turning the sky the color of a fresh bruise, that I realized the isolation was actually a perimeter. The horror didn't start with a scream. It started with the shoes. I woke up on the 4th morning to find a pair of mud-caked work boots sitting perfectly aligned on my welcome mat. They weren't mine, and they weren't my aunt's. They were old. The leather cracked like sun-dried skin, and they were still steaming in the morning chill. I threw them into the woods, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. But when I turned back to the house, I saw a single muddy footprint on the glass of the 2nd-story window. That evening, the silence of the woods became absolute. In the South, the woods are never quiet. There is always the roar of cicadas or the low hoot of an owl. But at 7 p.m., the sound was sucked out of the world as if a vacuum had been turned on. I stood on the porch, my skin prickling. Then, from the direction of the old tobacco barn, I heard a voice. It wasn't a shout. It was a wet, sloppy sound, like someone trying to speak with a mouth full of stones. Elara. The gate is unlatched. I didn't have a gate. I didn't have anyone to call me by name. I retreated inside, locking the heavy oak door and shoving the deadbolt home. I moved from room to room, drawing the curtains, but as I reached the kitchen, I stopped. The back door, which I knew I had locked, was standing wide open. The screen door was swaying gently in a wind I couldn't feel, its hinges screaming like a wounded animal. On the linoleum floor, a trail of wet black Appalachian mud led directly to the cellar door. I grabbed a butcher knife from the block, my knuckles white. I wanted to believe it was a squatter, some local meth head trying to scare the city girl away, but the smell that wafted up from the cellar was ancient. It smelled of deep caves and things that had never seen the sun. I crept toward the cellar door, the floorboards groaning under my feet. I reached out a trembling hand to close it, but a voice whispered from the darkness below, a voice that sounded exactly like my own. "Don't look down. Alara, you won't like what I've done with your face." I slammed the door and bolted it, leaning my back against the wood. Something hit the other side hard. It wasn't a hand. It was a heavy, wet thud, like a carcass being dropped from a great height. The wood groaned, and the scent of copper filled the air. I ran for the stairs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I locked myself in the master bedroom, the only room with a reinforced door. I sat on the bed, clutching the knife, watching the gap at the bottom of the door. Then the scratching started. Not on the door, but inside the walls. I could hear something moving through the insulation, something heavy and multi-limbed. It moved with a sickening liquid grace, sliding through the narrow spaces between the studs. It hummed a low, dissonant tune, the same lullaby my mother used to sing to me. "They told you not to stay," the walls whispered. "They told you the land was hungry. Why didn't you listen to the neighbors, Alara?" I realized then that the house wasn't a shelter. It was a ribcage. I was sitting in the belly of something that had been waiting decades for a miller to come home. My aunt hadn't died of natural causes. The house had simply finished digesting her. I looked at the window, desperate to jump, but the glass was gone. In its place was a translucent membrane of skin, pulsing with blue veins. The house was sealing itself shut. I scrambled to the corner of the room, the knife useless in my hand. The floorboards beneath me began to soften, turning from oak to something that felt like muscle. The ceiling started to drip a thick amber fluid that burned when it touched my skin. "It's almost over," the voice from the cellar said, now sounding much closer, sounding as if it were right behind my head. "The soil needs its seeds, and you have such beautiful marrow." I felt a hand cold, clammy, and missing several fingers wrap around my ankle from beneath the bed. It didn't pull me down. It started to merge with me. My skin began to graft onto the hand, the two of us becoming one singular organism of flesh and floorboard. I tried to scream, but my throat was filled with the taste of dry Kentucky dirt. I looked down and saw my legs were already turning gray, the texture of my shins becoming indistinguishable from the wood of the house. The house began to groan, a deep tectonic sound of satisfaction. The lights flickered and died, leaving me in a darkness so thick I could feel it pressing against my eyeballs. In that blackness, I saw the eyes of the things that lived in the walls, thousands of them, all different colors, all belonging to the people who had disappeared over the last 100 years. They weren't dead, they were the architecture. And now I was going to be the new front door. As the last of my consciousness began to fade into the grain of the wood, I heard the sound of a car engine far off in the distance. Another traveler, perhaps. Another person looking for a quiet place to stay. My mouth, now a knot in the wood of the wall, tried to form a warning, but all that came out was a soft, rhythmic creak. I was no longer Alara. I was the farm. The sun rose the next morning, but I didn't see it. I felt it as a warmth on my siding. I felt the squirrels running across my shingles. And when the car finally pulled into the red clay driveway, I felt a thrill of hunger vibrate through my foundation. The front door, my new mouth, swung open on its own, welcoming the visitor into the cool, dark shade of the foyer. The warnings were true, but nobody ever listens until they're part of the floor. The new girl stepped inside, her heels clicking on my ribs. She looked around at the charming Victorian and smiled. I felt her pulse through the floorboards, a sweet rhythmic drumming that promised a long, slow meal. I whispered her name through the vents, a soft, inviting sound that she mistook for the wind. "Welcome home," I creaked, the house settling around her like a trap. The drought of the 1990s didn't just kill the crops in Oak Haven, Nebraska. It turned the soil into a fine gray ash that tasted like iron and old pennies. My grandfather, a man whose skin looked like a road map of the Great Plains, managed to keep his farm green while the rest of the county withered into husks. He did it by following one rule, a rule he carved into the headboard of my bed the summer I turned 12. Never open the barn after the sun touches the horizon. I am Casey, and back then, I was a girl who believed rules were just challenges in disguise. My grandfather was a man of few words and heavy boots, a man who spent his nights sitting on the porch with a loaded shotgun across his knees, staring not at the road, but at the sprawling, windowless red barn that sat 300 yards from the farmhouse. He didn't lock the barn to keep people out. He locked it to keep the night from getting in. The hook of the horror didn't snag me until the final week of August. The heat was a physical weight, a shimmering curtain that made the corn stalks look like skeletal fingers reaching for the throat of the sky. My grandfather had fallen ill, his lungs rattling with a sound like dry husks rubbing together. As he lay in his bed, sweat drenching his sheets, he grabbed my wrist with a strength that shouldn't have been in him. "The barn, Casey," he wheezed, his eyes milky with cataracts. "If you hear your name, it isn't me. If you hear the horses, they aren't ours." That night, the crickets went silent at 7:42 p.m. The absence of their rhythmic chirping felt like a physical blow to the ears. I stood on the back porch, watching the sky turn the color of a fresh bruise. The barn stood in the center of the field, its red paint peeling like sunburned skin. In the twilight, the building seemed to breathe, the heavy timber expanding and contracting with a slow, wet rhythm. I heard it then, the sound of a bolt sliding back. It was a heavy, metallic shriek that echoed across the dead fields. Then came the thud. Something was kicking the inside of the barn doors, a rhythmic, powerful strike that made the entire structure shudder. Thump, thump. It sounded like a heart beating in the chest of the earth. I should have stayed on the porch. I should have listened to the old man dying in the bedroom behind me. But then, a voice drifted across the yard. It wasn't the voice of a monster. It was the voice of my mother, who had died when I was 3. "Casey," she sighed, the sound carried on a wind that shouldn't have existed in a stagnant heat. "It's so hot in here, baby. Open the door. Let the breeze in." The logic of a 12-year-old is a fragile thing, easily shattered by the ghost of a mother's tone. I found myself walking. The dust of the driveway was cold beneath my bare feet, a biting, unnatural chill that traveled up my spine. As I drew closer to the barn, the smell hit me. It wasn't the smell of hay or manure. It was the scent of a stagnant pond, thick, green, and smelling of things that have been underwater for a very long time. The barn doors were 30 feet high, held shut by a massive iron bar that my grandfather usually moved with a pulley system. But as I stood before it, the bar was vibrating. The wood was hot to the touch, pulsing with a low-frequency hum that made my teeth ache. "Mama?" I whispered, my hand resting on a splintered oak. The kicking stopped. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like water filling my lungs. Then, A soft wet sliding sound came from the other side of the wood. Something was pressing itself against the door, right where my face was. "Open it, Casey," the voice said, but the pitch was wrong now. It was too high, flickering between my mother's lilt and a sound like grinding stones. "The master is thirsty. The well is dry and the corn needs the red rain." I looked down at the gap between the barn doors and the dirt. A fluid was seeping out. It wasn't oil and it wasn't blood. It was a thick, translucent ichor that glowed with a faint, sickly bioluminescence. Within the fluid, thousands of tiny, pale worms writhed, reaching their blind heads toward my toes. I scrambled back, but the voice inside the barn became a chorus. It wasn't just my mother anymore. I heard my own voice, the voice I'd have 10 years in the future screaming for mercy. The iron bar on the door began to rise. Not from the outside, but as if being lifted by invisible magnetic hands. The barn was opening itself. The heavy doors groaned, the hinges screaming in a pitch that shattered the windows of the nearby silo. I turned to run, but the air around the barn had turned to syrup. Every movement felt like wading through chest-high snow. I looked back over my shoulder. The doors were ajar just a few inches. In the darkness of the barn's interior, there were no horses. There were no tractors. There was only a vast, pulsating mass of gray-white flesh that filled the entire space from floor to rafters. It looked like a giant lung made of wet parchment. Thousands of thin, umbilical-like cords hung from the ceiling, and at the end of each cord was a face, the faces of every animal that had ever gone missing in Oakhaven, and the faces of people from the missing posters at the local post office. Their eyes were sewn shut with corn silk. Their mouths were open, emitting that low, vibrating hum. In the center of the mass, a single eye opened. It was the size of a wagon wheel, the iris a swirling storm of gold and black. It didn't look at me. It absorbed me. I felt my memories being peeled away like layers of an onion. My first day of school, the taste of a summer peach, the smell of my grandfather's tobacco, all being sucked into the eye. A hand reached out from the darkness. It was long with too many knuckles, and it was draped in a tattered red flannel shirt, my grandfather's shirt. But my grandfather was in the house. The hand gripped the edge of the door, the fingers sinking into the wood as if it were soft butter. "The rule, Casey," the thing in the flannel shirt hissed, his voice a perfect mimicry of my grandfather's gruff baritone. "You forgot the rule." I found my voice and screamed, a raw primal sound that broke the trance. The fever in my blood seemed to snap. I lunged for the pulley rope, my hands raw and bleeding as I threw my entire weight against it. The iron bar slammed back down into its cradles with a thunderous crack that echoed off the hills. The screaming from inside the barn turned into a low, disappointed hiss. I didn't stop running until I reached the farmhouse. I locked every door, pushed the dresser in front of the stairs, and huddled in my grandfather's room. He was awake, his eyes clear for the first time in weeks. He looked at my bleeding hands and the glow-in-the-dark slime on my feet. He didn't ask what happened. He just sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion. "It's seen you now, Casey," he whispered. "It knows the shape of your soul. I kept it fed for 40 years, but my time is done." He passed away an hour before dawn. When the sun rose, the barn looked like a normal old building again. There was no slime, no giant eye, no umbilical cords. But when I went to the barn to check the lock, I found a single object sitting on the threshold. It was my mother's wedding ring, which had been buried with her 18 years ago. It was perfectly clean, except for a single fresh drop of red blood on the inside of the band. I'm 32 now. I live in the city, in a high-rise made of glass and steel, as far from the soil as I can get. But every night, when the sun touches the horizon, I find myself checking the locks on my doors. Because sometimes, when the wind blows from the west, I can hear the sound of a heavy iron bar vibrating. And a voice that sounds exactly like mine whispers from the hallway, asking me to come home and open the door.